For years, a cold and distant billionaire lived with a terrible secret in his mansion. His young son, believed to be born deaf, spent every single day trying to ask for help, pointing to his ear and crying, but nobody ever listened. Dozens of nannies came and went, each calling him aggressive or broken, until one day a new housekeeper arrived. A quiet woman who actually paid attention. She noticed a strange pattern, something no one else had seen before. And when she finally understood the signal the boy had been trying to send all along, she uncovered a shocking truth that would destroy the family's past. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. Since the day his wife died during childbirth, Richard Coleman changed completely. Once known for his charisma and charm, the billionaire became distant and cold. He buried himself in his company, spending all his time in meetings, offices, and business trips. At home, he avoided anything that reminded him of her, especially their son, Liam. Richard didn't talk about the baby, didn't ask about him, and barely even looked at the photos in the house. He hired people to take care of Liam, thinking that money and a big house would be enough. But Liam, just a baby at the time, had already lost something huge, his mother, and now his father was emotionally gone too. Richard thought he was doing the right thing by keeping busy, thinking time would make the pain smaller, but all he was really doing was running away. And as the years passed, his distance didn't just hurt himself. It left Liam growing up surrounded by strangers without the love and care he truly needed. Liam was diagnosed as deaf from birth, and this made everything harder. As a baby, he couldn't hear the world around him, but he tried his best to understand it. He pointed to things, looked people in the eyes, and made sounds that weren't words, but were full of meaning. He often touched his ear, trying to show that he couldn't hear, but no one really noticed. Nannies and housekeepers came and went. They stayed for a few days or weeks, but none lasted long. They said Liam was difficult. Some said he threw things when he got upset. Others said he didn't follow instructions. But no one ever stopped to think that maybe he just couldn't understand them, and that they didn't understand him. Each time someone gave up on Liam, he felt more confused and more alone. He wasn't being mean or wild. He was trying to survive in a world that didn't speak his language. But instead of helping him, people judged him. Some of the staff began to whisper behind closed doors, saying Liam was more than just difficult. They used words like emotionally unstable and damaged. One woman even said he scared her because of the way he stared in silence. Another suggested he might have something wrong in the head, and that maybe he should be put somewhere safe, away from people. Over time, the voices got louder, and the judgment turned into serious recommendations. A few professionals were brought in, but they didn't spend much time with Liam. They gave quick opinions based on short visits and suggested psychiatric evaluation. They didn't understand Liam's silence wasn't from trauma or a disorder. It was simply because he couldn't hear. But no one listened. And when Richard heard these suggestions, he didn't question them. He didn't investigate. He agreed, too full of his own sorrow to see the truth. He thought maybe these experts knew better. So, slowly, Liam was treated not like a child needing help, but like a problem to be managed. Every day became the same for Liam. He would wake up and see a new face in the hallway, a new nanny trying to smile but not knowing how to talk to him. He would try to show them what he needed by pointing, by tugging their sleeves, by moving his lips in silent ways. He didn't have the words, but he had feelings. He had needs. But no one stayed long enough to learn them. When he cried, they thought he was being dramatic. When he hit the floor in frustration, they saw it as anger. But Liam was not angry. He was heartbroken. Every failed attempt to communicate made him feel more trapped. He wanted to be understood. He wanted someone to realize that his world was quiet, not by choice, but by nature. Every time he was ignored or misunderstood, a piece of hope inside him faded. He began to expect disappointment. He stopped trying as much. Why try when no one ever truly saw him? Even though Richard lived in the same house, he didn't notice Liam's suffering. He was always in his office, on his phone, or away on trips. When he did see Liam, it was for a few minutes and he didn't know what to say. He felt awkward. Liam, on the other hand, stared at his father with wide eyes, hoping for a sign of love or attention. He pointed to his ears again and again, hoping Richard would understand. But Richard just nodded or walked away. He was too lost in his own grief to recognize his son's pain. Deep inside, Richard blamed himself for his wife's death. He thought that maybe keeping his distance from Liam was the best way to avoid the reminder. But what he didn't see was that Liam was the one person who needed him most. While Richard thought he was protecting himself, he was slowly breaking his son's spirit. Liam didn't understand loss, but he could feel the emptiness left behind by a father who never truly looked at him. As the years passed, Liam learned not to expect kindness. He became quieter, more careful. He kept to himself, sitting for hours in his room, playing with the same few toys, looking at books he couldn't read, watching lips move without understanding the sounds. He learned to live in a world that barely noticed he was there. The staff spoke around him, but rarely to him. No one learned sign language. No one brought in a specialist who could help him communicate. He was just the deaf kid in the big house. The more people ignored his efforts, the more Liam pulled back. He started to believe what people said about him. Maybe he really was broken. Maybe he didn't belong in the world. His young heart, once full of curiosity, was now tired. He stopped pointing to his ears. He stopped trying to get their attention. Silence became his reality, not just because he couldn't hear, but because no one wanted to hear him either. Hope was slipping away, But even in all that sadness, something inside Liam still waited, just a small part of him that hadn't given up completely. He still looked out the window every day, wondering if someone would come and notice him. He watched the front door, hoping maybe this time a nanny would smile and stay. He still waited for his father to sit with him, even just for a few minutes, and try to understand. But those moments never came. Each day passed like the one before, and the house felt colder, quieter. Richard, lost in guilt and memories, never realized the damage being done right in front of him. The staff continued to rotate in and out, writing reports, giving opinions, but offering no real help. Liam's small hopes began to shrink even more. And by the time he stopped trying to show people he was deaf, his young heart had already started to lose its belief that things could ever be different. The silence had won, for now. On a grey Monday morning, Ava Thompson arrived at the Coleman mansion carrying a single bag and a folder of paperwork. The large iron gates opened slowly as she approached, and the driver dropped her off in front of the main entrance. The mansion was quiet, almost too quiet for a house with a child. Ava was a calm and confident woman in her late 30s, with a steady look in her eyes and a presence that made people feel safe. She had worked in several households before, caring for children with different needs, but this job felt different from the start. The staff barely greeted her, speaking only to point her to her room and hand her a schedule. As she unpacked her things, she heard whispers from the hallway, some saying she wouldn't last, others saying, "He'll break her too." She didn't ask questions. Instead, she went to the kitchen, poured herself a glass of water, and prepared for her first meeting with the boy she had come to care for, Liam. When Ava finally saw Liam, he was sitting alone on the floor, in a room full of toys that hadn't been touched. He wasn't playing. He was simply staring at the carpet, occasionally moving his hands in short, repeated motions. When she walked in, he looked at her briefly, then turned away. She noticed how he tapped his ear a few times, pointed at her mouth, and then went back to staring at the floor. Right away, she knew he was trying to communicate, not acting out. She didn't say anything. She sat on the floor, a short distance from him, and waited. He glanced at her again, confused, as if no adult had ever sat that way near him before. Ava didn't force a smile or push a conversation. She simply observed. The staff had told her Liam was aggressive and unresponsive, but she saw no aggression, just a child who had learned that no one listened. When the session ended, Ava thanked him, even though he didn't understand her words yet. She left the room already feeling a strong sense that something had been wrong with how others had seen him. In the hallway, Ava was approached by one of the older housekeepers who had been there for years. The woman gave a tired sigh and told Ava not to get attached and to keep some distance. She warned her about the emotional toll and said that past nannies had tried to help Liam and failed. Some ended up crying, others quit without notice. A few were fired after making strange accusations about the boy's behavior. "He's not like other kids," the housekeeper said. But Ava didn't respond. She just nodded politely and walked away. She understood what they were saying, but she also knew that labeling a child so harshly without understanding him was harmful. She had seen this before in other homes, especially with children who had disabilities. She didn't believe in giving up easily, and certainly not on a child. That night, instead of going to bed early, Ava asked for access to Liam's records. She wanted to see for herself what had been written about him. Ava spent hours reading through Liam's medical files, caregiver notes, and school reports. There were dozens of reports from professionals, each with different opinions. Some said he was emotionally unstable, others thought he had behavioral disorders. Many mentioned his deafness, but only as a side note. No one seemed to focus on how he communicated or how to meet his specific needs. Most entries described his actions, but never his feelings. One note read, "Throws blocks when frustrated." But Ava thought, what if that was his only way to say he was overwhelmed? Another report said, "Unwilling to engage," but based on her short time with him earlier, Ava didn't agree. He had made eye contact. He had gestured. That was engagement. Ava marked the parts of the reports that felt off and made a list of things to try. She realized no one had made a serious effort to connect with Liam through his world. Everyone had expected him to adapt to theirs. Ava wasn't going to make that same mistake. Lying in bed later that night, Ava kept thinking about Liam. She couldn't sleep. She replayed the moment he pointed at his ear over and over in her mind. It was a simple gesture, but it was filled with meaning. It said, "I can't hear you," and maybe also, "Please understand me." Ava wondered how many times he had done that and been ignored, how many people had walked away without trying. She thought about how lonely it must feel to live in a world where no one tried to reach you. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing for sure. Liam didn't need fixing. He needed understanding. She pulled out a notebook from her bag and wrote down one sentence. "I will not give up on this child." It was a promise to herself and to Liam. She knew the journey ahead would be hard, but she wasn't afraid of hard. She had taken this job for a reason, and now that she had seen Liam, that reason felt even stronger. The next morning, Ava woke up early and went straight to work. She started learning simple sign language from videos on her phone. She looked up books on deaf communication and how to work with children who had been emotionally neglected. She asked the kitchen staff to let her know what foods Liam liked. Then, instead of going to him with instructions, she simply sat nearby again and mirrored some of his hand gestures to see his reaction. At first, he looked confused, then curious. Slowly, she saw a spark in his eyes, small, but there. She gave him space, but stayed close enough to show she wasn't going anywhere. Staff members kept their distance, still skeptical. They whispered that Ava was wasting her time, but she didn't care. She was there for Liam, not for their approval. Every small look, every quiet moment was a step forward. Ava knew that healing didn't start with big changes. It started with someone choosing to stay. And Ava had already made her choice. While vacuuming near the playroom in the late afternoon, Ava moved carefully around the edges of the large, quiet room. The staff had told her this was Liam's favorite space, but when she looked inside, it was completely silent and empty. She turned off the vacuum for a moment, trying to listen for anything unusual. Then she heard it, a soft sound, almost like a whimper. She moved closer, walking past shelves of untouched toys and picture books. That's when she saw something underneath a wooden table in the corner. She bent down and spotted Liam curled up with his knees to his chest, his small hands gripping something tightly. As she got closer, she realized he was holding a hearing device. His eyes were red, his cheeks wet with tears. He kept pointing to the device again and again, his hands shaking. He looked at Ava with desperation, his mouth moving, though no sound came. He was scared. Something was wrong. Ava slowly crouched beside him, trying not to alarm him more. Ava didn't reach for him right away. She gently placed the vacuum handle against the wall and sat on the floor, keeping a safe distance. She watched as Liam repeated the same movement, tapping the device in his hand and then pointing to his ear. She nodded slowly and copied his action with her own hand, pointing to her ear as well. Liam looked at her, startled, like no adult had ever done that before. His crying slowed just a little. He looked back and forth between her face and her hands, confused but curious. Ava didn't say anything out loud. She knew he couldn't hear her, but she stayed there, completely focused on him. He lifted the device toward her, not to give it to her, but to show it. Then he pointed to his head and closed his eyes tightly, as if showing pain. Ava leaned forward just a bit and kept mirroring his motions. Liam's breathing slowed. He was still upset, but no longer panicked. For the first time, someone was listening, even without words. After Liam calmed down a little, Ava carefully watched what happened when the device was near him. When he tried to put it back on, his body tensed up immediately. His fingers curled and his eyes shut tightly. He leaned against the table leg and seemed dizzy, as if the device caused him physical discomfort. When he took it off, his shoulders relaxed, and he looked more at ease. She didn't want to jump to conclusions, but this wasn't normal. A hearing aid should help, not hurt. Over the next few minutes, Ava repeated this quiet test. She let him try it on and off without pressure. Every time he wore it, his expression turned to pain. Without it, he was calmer, even willing to look around the room. Ava's mind was racing. How had no one seen this? How many times had he been forced to wear it while suffering? She wondered if the staff assumed his distress was just part of his behavioral problems. But now, she suspected something else. As soon as Liam seemed stable, Ava gently gestured that she was going to stand up. He nodded a little and wiped his eyes. Ava walked straight to her room and pulled out her notebook, writing down every detail she had just witnessed. She listed each reaction he had with the device and without it. She remembered the reports that described Liam's outbursts and meltdowns, and suddenly they made sense in a new way. Maybe he wasn't acting out, maybe he was reacting to pain. She didn't have a medical background, but she had seen enough in her past jobs to know something wasn't right. She carefully opened the case file again and saw that the device had been issued over a year ago. There were no updates or notes about its condition. It hadn't been checked in months. Ava wondered how long Liam had been trying to tell someone, anyone, that the device was hurting him. But no one had understood, or worse, no one had cared. That evening, Ava went to speak with one of the senior staff members about the device. She explained what she had seen and suggested that Liam be taken to an audiologist to check the equipment. The staff member frowned and shook her head. "It's not the device," she said. "He does this all the time. He's just dramatic." Ava pushed back gently, explaining the clear differences in his behavior with and without the hearing aid. But the woman didn't listen. "We've seen it before," she said. "He's just unpredictable." Frustrated, Ava realized they had already made up their minds about Liam. To them, he was broken and difficult. They didn't want new information. They wanted things to stay simple, even if it meant ignoring the truth. Ava left the conversation angry, but more determined than ever. She knew she couldn't count on the others. If Liam was going to get real help, she'd have to be the one to start the process. Later that night, Ava returned to the playroom. Liam was lying on the couch, holding a stuffed animal, his eyes half closed. When he saw her, he sat up slowly. She smiled and pointed to the hearing device, then made a sad face, hoping he'd understand she knew it hurt him. He looked surprised, then nodded once. She walked over, sat beside him, and took out a small notepad. She drew a simple picture of an ear with a red X over it. Liam studied it carefully, then looked up at her. She placed her hand gently on her chest and mouthed, "Okay." He didn't respond with words, but his eyes seemed different, less afraid. That moment told Ava everything she needed to know. This child hadn't been acting out. He had been surviving. And now, with this small signal, Ava had proof. Something was wrong with the device, and it had affected Liam's behavior all along. As she watched him finally relax, Ava felt her heart beat faster. Maybe, just maybe, she had found the missing piece. Ava sat at her desk late at night with the small hearing device in front of her. The house was quiet, the hallway lights dim, and everyone else had gone to bed. She had carefully borrowed the device from Liam's belongings after he had fallen asleep, making sure not to disturb him. With her laptop open, she began searching the serial number printed on the side of the device. She typed it into several search engines, hoping to find a product manual, a customer service number, or anything that could give her more information. But every search came back with nothing useful. The number wasn't listed on any public medical sites or manufacturer databases. She checked again to make sure she had typed it correctly. Then she tried looking up the brand printed in tiny letters on the side, Neurosonics. That name brought up scattered results, nothing clear, only vague mentions in medical articles and research forums. She felt uneasy. Something didn't feel right. Why would a child be wearing a hearing device with no public record? As she dug deeper into her online search, Ava began finding discussions on old forums related to medical technology and experimental treatments. A few posts mentioned neurosonics in connection with neurological testing and early-stage prototypes for children with hearing loss. Some users described strange side effects, headaches, dizziness, confusion, but the information was thin, often deleted or marked as inconclusive. There were no company websites, no user manuals, and no official studies. One comment mentioned that Neurosonics had once partnered with a private hospital to test neuromodulation devices, but the program had ended years ago after legal issues. Ava leaned back in her chair, staring at the screen. If Liam's device was one of those early test models, why was he still wearing it? Who had approved it? The more she read, the more questions she had. None of this felt like standard medical care. It felt like someone had given a child untested equipment without proper oversight. Ava knew she needed help from someone who understood the medical world better than she did. Ava picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the name. Dr. Emily Ward. They had grown up in the same neighborhood and stayed in touch over the years. Emily had gone on to become a respected medical director at a children's hospital. They hadn't spoken in months, but Ava didn't hesitate. She called her. Emily answered on the third ring. At first, they exchanged quick greetings, but Ava got straight to the point. She explained the strange device Liam had been wearing and how it seemed to cause distress rather than help. She mentioned the odd serial number and the name Neurosonics. Emily asked for photos, so Ava took several pictures from different angles and sent them. A few minutes later, Emily called back, sounding serious. She said she had never seen anything like it. She asked, "Are you sure this was given to him by a medical professional?" Ava hesitated. "That's what his file says, but now I'm not sure." Emily said she'd look into it immediately. The next morning, Emily called back with more concern in her voice. She had spoken with a few colleagues and even searched her hospital's records. She confirmed that Neurosonics was a real company, but had a history of shutting down studies after patient complaints. It wasn't a mainstream manufacturer and had never released commercial devices. The model Liam had was not approved by any major medical agency. Even more alarming, Emily told Ava that based on the device's design, it didn't look like a standard hearing aid at all. She believed it might be emitting signals to the brain, not helping hearing, but possibly interfering with it. "This isn't helping him," Emily said. "It might be disabling his hearing on purpose." Ava felt a chill run through her. She asked the question she hadn't dared to ask before. What if Liam was never deaf? Emily didn't answer right away. Finally, she said, "It's possible. I've seen cases misdiagnosed before, but with something like this involved, it's hard to say." Ava kept observing Liam closely and documenting everything: how he responded with and without the device, how he reacted to sounds, light, and movement. Emily, on her side, pulled every contact she had in the medical world, trying to trace the origins of the device. She found an old article buried in an academic journal that mentioned Neurosonics as part of a controversial trial where some children were fitted with prototype devices as part of a study on brain stimulation. The article had been pulled offline years ago, but Emily had a saved copy. It didn't name patients, but the location of the trials lined up with the area where Liam had been born. Ava started going through Liam's file again and noticed something strange. The original diagnosis of permanent deafness was written by a single doctor. No second opinions, no updated tests. No hearing tests had been performed after that point. The device had been introduced early, and no one had questioned it since. Ava sat at her desk again that night, this time with all her notes spread out around her. Everything she and Emily had found pointed to one disturbing possibility. Liam had been misunderstood, not just emotionally, but physically. What if this device had been altering his hearing for years? What if the strange behaviors, so often labeled as aggression or instability, were actually reactions to the device's harmful effects? The idea was shocking. Ava remembered the moment she found Liam crying under the table, clutching the device. He had been trying to say something no one had taken the time to understand. Now, with the truth starting to come together, Ava knew they had opened a much bigger puzzle than expected. This wasn't just about one child. It was about a company, a mistake, and a life shaped by a silent error. And now that Ava had started pulling the thread, there was no turning back. She and Emily had made a quiet promise to find the truth, no matter how deep it went. Ava decided she couldn't wait any longer. The mystery around Liam's condition had gone on for too long, and the more she learned about the device, the more suspicious she became. One quiet morning, when most of the staff were busy elsewhere, she set up a few simple objects in the playroom: a small bell, a toy drum, a musical box, and a set of colorful blocks that made sounds when shaken. She wanted to test something basic. Liam was sitting on the floor, drawing shapes on paper. Ava smiled at him, then gently pointed to the hearing device on the table. She gestured for him to leave it off. He hesitated for a second, then nodded. When the device was off, she picked up the bell behind him and rang it softly. To her shock, Liam turned his head immediately. She froze. Then she clapped her hands twice. Again he reacted. He smiled faintly, as if hearing something pleasant. Ava's heart raced. This couldn't be right. Liam could hear. Ava continued her small experiments carefully over the next few minutes. She didn't want to scare or confuse him, so she made each sound part of a game. She shook the blocks and watched him look toward them every time. She rolled a toy car that made noise, and he followed it with his eyes. When she spoke softly behind him, he turned to face her, trying to read her lips, but also clearly reacting to the sound itself. The realization hit her hard. Liam wasn't deaf. He never had been. His reactions weren't random. They were natural, clear, and consistent. She felt an overwhelming mix of relief, anger, and sadness. How many years had this child lived, believing he couldn't hear, forced to wear a device that may have damaged him? Ava covered her mouth, trying not to cry. Liam, not understanding, simply smiled and clapped when she did, thinking it was part of the game. She smiled back, but inside she felt her stomach twist. This wasn't a miracle. It was a tragedy. After calming down, Ava sat beside Liam and helped him clean up the toys. She watched him play for a while, trying to understand how no one else had ever noticed this. Surely someone must have tested him before. But then she remembered the reports. How every document said not to remove the device. How no one had ever done an assessment without it. Everyone had just accepted the diagnosis, including Richard. Ava realized this wasn't an innocent mistake. Someone had made sure Liam's condition would never be questioned. Later that afternoon, while Liam was napping, she went downstairs to find the head housekeeper, Mrs. Grant, who had been with the family for years. Ava needed answers, and she believed Mrs. Grant knew more than she had said before. She found her in the kitchen, organizing supplies. "Mrs. Grant," Ava began quietly, "I need to ask you something important about Liam's hearing device." The older woman stopped what she was doing and looked uneasy. Mrs. Grant hesitated before speaking. "What about it?" she asked, trying to sound casual. Ava didn't waste time. She explained what she had seen, how Liam reacted to sounds even without the device. Mrs. Grant's face grew pale. She lowered her voice and looked around to make sure no one else was nearby. "You shouldn't be testing him like that," she whispered. "We were told, strictly told, not to remove it, not even for a minute." Ava frowned. "Told by who?" Mrs. Grant avoided her eyes. "His doctors. They said it was part of his treatment. They said it was dangerous to take it off." Ava crossed her arms, her frustration growing. "Dangerous for who, Mrs. Grant? Because I just saw a child who can hear perfectly fine when that thing isn't on his ear." The housekeeper looked torn, her hands shaking slightly. "All I know is they gave orders directly to Mr. Coleman. He followed everything they said. None of us were allowed to question it. So, everyone just obeyed. No one ever wondered why the boy got sick or scared whenever he wore it." Mrs. Grant looked down, guilt written all over her face. "We did wonder," she admitted softly. "But every time someone said something, they were dismissed. The doctor said the reactions were normal, that it was part of adjusting. When new staff joined and questioned the process, they were replaced. It happened more than once. I've seen people fired for less." Ava sat down across from her, feeling her anger boil. "This isn't treatment," she said firmly. "This is abuse. They made everyone believe he was broken when he wasn't." Mrs. Grant rubbed her forehead and sighed deeply. "Maybe you're right, but we were told it was for his safety, that the device protected him somehow. I never understood how, but I didn't ask. I didn't want to lose my job." Ava stared at her, realizing just how deep the manipulation went. That night, Ava couldn't sleep. She sat by her window, watching the faint lights of the city in the distance, replaying everything in her mind. The pieces were starting to fit together. Liam's deafness, his distress with the device, the silence in the house, and the strange connection to neurosonics. She thought about what Emily had said about the company's experiments and the idea that Liam's hearing could have been deliberately altered or blocked haunted her. This wasn't just a medical mistake. Someone had done this intentionally, and they had made money from it. She imagined the paperwork, the contracts, the fake medical files, all the lies that had built this false story of a deaf boy. Meanwhile, Liam had lived trapped in silence that was never his own. Ava felt a mix of fury and determination rise inside her. She looked toward his room, where he slept peacefully for once, and whispered to herself, they used him. Now, more than ever, she knew what she had to do. The truth had finally surfaced, and there was no turning back. Dr. Emily Ward sat in her office, her desk covered with papers, printouts, and notes. After the call with Ava, she couldn't stop thinking about the strange hearing device and the name Neurosonics. She had seen shady companies before, but something about this one felt worse. Over the next few days, Emily poured every free hour into researching the company. She used her hospital access, reached out to private forums, and dug into archived medical journals. Slowly, a pattern began to emerge. Neurosonics had been part of a secret project years ago, one focused on neuromodulation in children. The testing had been hidden behind vague terms like auditory correction trials and cognitive support therapy. The worst part was the discovery of a familiar name on one of the older reports. Dr. Rinaldi. He was the same man who diagnosed Liam as deaf. Emily's hands trembled as she read further. Rinaldi had been investigated before in another country for altering medical records and misreporting trial outcomes. He had disappeared from public view until now. Emily sent everything she found to Ava in an encrypted file. Ava read each page with growing horror. The reports were clear. Rinaldi had partnered with Neurosonics to test experimental devices on minors without proper approvals. The documents showed that many children experienced side effects, dizziness, headaches, anxiety, but these were left out of official records. Some children had been labeled with false diagnoses to justify using the device. Liam wasn't the only victim, but he was possibly the only one still wearing the device. Ava was sick to her stomach. It explained everything: the rushed diagnosis, the order to never remove the hearing aid, and the resistance from the estate staff. Someone had been protecting Rinaldi's work, keeping Liam trapped in a false identity for years. Ava couldn't believe that this had been happening in plain sight. As she scrolled through the files, she knew this wasn't just about helping one boy anymore. It was about exposing a system that had stolen Liam's voice, and maybe others too. Despite the darkness behind the scenes, something beautiful had started happening between Ava and Liam. Day by day, their connection grew stronger. With the device off, Liam seemed calmer and more open. He didn't flinch as much. He watched Ava closely and started reacting more clearly to her expressions and movements. Ava introduced games where they matched pictures to objects, and soon they moved on to drawing basic emotions: happy, sad, scared, excited. Liam understood quickly. He began pointing to faces that matched his feelings. Ava also taught him simple gestures to say yes, no, more, and stop. The more they worked together, the more Liam responded. His eyes lit up when Ava walked into the room. He smiled when she laughed. He even began to hum sometimes, low and uncertain, but it was a sound. For the first time in his life, Liam wasn't being treated like a problem. He was being seen as a person. Ava knew that trust took time, but Liam was finally letting someone in. But not everyone was happy with the changes. Unknown to Ava, her work with Liam had drawn attention. One afternoon, while she was helping Liam build a block tower, she noticed one of the senior staff members standing nearby, watching them too closely. His name was Harris, the estate manager, a man who had been with the family for years. He rarely spoke to Ava directly, but had always seemed distant and disapproving. That day, he stayed longer than usual, making notes on a clipboard and asking odd questions. Later, Ava found her supply cabinet locked and her schedule slightly changed without notice. At first, she thought it was a mistake, but it kept happening. One evening, she overheard Harris on the phone in the hallway. He spoke in a low tone, but mentioned her name, Liam, and the word interference. Her chest tightened. She realized someone was watching her, tracking what she was doing with Liam. They didn't like the progress. They didn't want the truth to come out. Someone wanted her gone. Ava tried to stay calm. She didn't want Liam to feel her fear, but she began being more careful. She backed up all her notes, kept copies of Emily's findings, and avoided speaking openly around staff she didn't trust. At the same time, she made sure to keep her bond with Liam strong. She smiled, played, and kept everything normal on the outside. But deep down, she was preparing for the worst. One night, she found a printed warning slipped under her door. It didn't have a name, just one line: "You're getting too close. Stop now." Her heart pounded. She locked the door and sat by the window, gripping her phone. She knew this meant the investigation had struck a nerve. Whoever had been covering up the truth didn't want it exposed. But Ava wasn't the same person she had been when she first arrived. She wasn't just a housekeeper anymore. She was a protector. And no matter who was trying to silence her, she wasn't going to back down. The pressure kept growing. Harris began limiting her access to Liam's reports. Some of her usual cleaning duties were reassigned, giving her less time with the boy. Ava worked around it, using breaks and mealtimes to continue her sessions. She acted like nothing was wrong, but inside, she was always alert, always watching. One afternoon, she caught Harris speaking with someone in a black car outside the mansion. They didn't shake hands. They just passed a folder, spoke briefly, and left. Ava knew then that this went beyond the household. It was bigger. Someone was protecting Rinaldi and neurosonics, and Ava's discoveries were now a threat. Still, when she looked at Liam laughing as he played with toy animals, she reminded herself why she started this. He was her reason. She had seen him change from a scared, silent child into a boy who smiled and reached out. No matter what happened next, Ava promised herself she would not stop. The truth was out there, and she was going to make sure it was heard. Richard Coleman returned home earlier than expected. His business trip had been cut short after a client cancelled a meeting last minute. It was late afternoon when his car pulled up in front of the mansion. Tired but in a quiet mood, he stepped inside without announcing himself. He planned to head straight to his office, but as he passed the hallway near the playroom, he stopped. Through the slightly open door, he saw Ava sitting on the floor with Liam. They weren't speaking, at least not out loud. Ava was using her hands, slowly and gently, making signs in the air. Liam was watching her carefully, then copying the signs. Richard's face tightened. To him, it looked like she was trying to teach Liam something that went against everything the doctors had instructed. He didn't stop to ask questions. He stepped inside, his voice loud and firm. "What do you think you're doing?" Ava stood up, startled. Richard didn't wait for an explanation. "You're done here. Pack your things." "You're fired?" He was convinced she had gone too far, breaking medical guidelines and interfering with Liam's condition. "You don't know what you're doing," he snapped. "You're not a doctor." Ava looked at Liam, who now stood frozen, his small hands halfway through a sign, confused by the sudden change. "You're making a mistake," she said calmly, but Richard pointed to the door. "Now." With no choice, Ava gathered her things quietly and left the house that evening. Liam watched her go from the window, his face blank, unable to understand why she was gone. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He kept remembering the scene, the way Liam had responded, the way he had copied Ava's signs, the way he had looked more connected than Richard had ever seen. Something about it didn't sit right. For the first time in years, Richard started asking himself questions he had never dared to ask. Could everything they'd been told about Liam be wrong? After midnight, unable to rest, Richard walked quietly into Liam's room. The boy was asleep, his small figure curled under the blanket. The hearing device was on the nightstand. Richard stared at it for a long time, then slowly picked it up. He remembered the strict instructions. Never remove the device. Always keep it on. It was part of Liam's treatment. But now, Richard wasn't so sure. He sat down, placed the device aside, and picked up an old music box from the shelf. He wound it up, holding his breath, and let the soft tune begin to play. Liam stirred slightly, then turned toward the sound. Richard felt his chest tighten. He picked up a toy with bells and gently shook it. Again, Liam moved his head toward it. Then, barely above a whisper, Richard spoke, "Liam?" And Liam turned to face him. Richard froze. His hands dropped to his lap. His heart began to race. His son had heard him. He hadn't imagined it. It was real. Tears filled Richard's eyes. For a long time, he had believed that Liam was deaf, unreachable, locked in a world of silence. Doctors had told him, specialists had confirmed it, and he had accepted it without question. But now, in the quiet of his son's bedroom, everything was falling apart. Richard covered his face and cried, not quietly, but with deep sobs that came from years of guilt and denial. He thought about all the times he had avoided Liam, all the times he had failed to try, all the moments that had been lost. His son had been trying to reach out, and no one had listened. Richard stayed in the room for hours, sitting beside Liam's bed, watching him sleep. When the sun began to rise, Richard knew what he had to do. He picked up his phone with shaking hands and dialed the last number he thought he'd call again. When Ava answered, there was silence for a moment. Then he said, "Please, I need your help." She looked cautious, unsure of what to expect. Richard met her at the door, his voice softer than she had ever heard. "I saw it," he told her. "Everything you said, you were right." Ava didn't say, "I told you so." She didn't show anger or frustration. She only asked, "What now?" Richard led her to the study, where they sat together and started talking. He showed her Liam's old medical records, files he had never looked at in depth before. Ava explained what she had discovered with Dr. Ward, and how the device might have been designed to block Liam's hearing rather than support it. They pieced together a timeline when the diagnosis happened, who was involved, how the estate staff had been instructed to follow strict orders. It all pointed to Dr. Rinaldi and his connection to neurosonics. The more they looked, the clearer it became. This wasn't a mistake. Someone had done this to Liam on purpose, and now they had to make it right. Richard felt overwhelmed by guilt, but Ava reminded him that Liam still had a future, and they could fight for it. Together, they started planning their next steps. Richard used his business connections to find a lawyer who specialized in medical malpractice and corporate corruption. Ava continued working with Dr. Ward, gathering proof of what had happened. They agreed to keep everything quiet for now. If Rinaldi or Neurosonics caught wind of the investigation, they might try to cover their tracks. Meanwhile, Ava returned to caring for Liam. Richard joined them more often, watching, learning, even trying the signs himself. Liam was confused at first, but happy to have Ava back. And when Richard tried to communicate, Liam smiled, really smiled, as if he saw his father for the first time. The plan was only beginning and the road ahead was dangerous, but something had changed. For the first time, Richard wasn't running from the truth. He was facing it. He was ready to fight, for Liam and for the years they had lost. With Dr. Ward's guidance, Richard took the first legal steps against Neurosonics. At her recommendation, he contacted a trusted legal team, one experienced in corporate investigations and medical negligence. The moment the lawyers reviewed the files, their reaction was clear. This was not just a case of medical error, it was a pattern of abuse. Using his influence, Richard arranged a private meeting with federal investigators. He didn't go in as a billionaire looking to protect his image. He went in as a father, trying to protect his son. He gave them every file, photo, and email Ava and Dr. Ward had collected. In just a few days, a formal criminal case was opened. Investigators began quietly tracking Neurosonics' activities and cross-checking patient histories. It didn't take long for the truth to come out. More children across the country were discovered with similar devices, unusual models, unregistered with medical boards, and linked back to Neurosonics. Some of the families had never even questioned the devices. Now, everything was about to change. News broke quickly once the investigation became public. Reporters flooded the networks with headlines about experimental devices implanted in children and illegal neuromodulation trials. Pictures of the devices, like the one Liam had worn for years, were shown on screens across the country. Parents came forward, angry and confused, some demanding answers, others suing the companies involved. The media dug into the background of Dr. Rinaldi, exposing past controversies and the previous investigation overseas that had been quietly dismissed. The clinic that diagnosed Liam was shut down almost overnight after authorities found altered records and financial ties to Neurosonics. The company itself released a vague statement denying wrongdoing, but that didn't hold up. Richard's legal team had already secured copies of signed contracts and internal memos, showing that profits were prioritized over patient safety. Rinaldi, once respected, became a wanted man. He tried to leave the country, but was caught at a private airport just before boarding. He was arrested and taken into custody for fraud, child endangerment, and conspiracy. While the outside world watched the scandal unfold, Ava remained focused on Liam. She kept his routine steady, making sure the chaos outside didn't interrupt his progress. Therapy sessions became more regular now, led by professionals who actually understood his needs. With Ava's help, Liam learned to trust again. She created flashcards with pictures and words, used sound games, and practiced basic sentences every day. He responded slowly, but consistently. One morning, while Ava was helping him dress, Liam looked at her and quietly said, "Mama." Ava froze. She turned to him, unsure if she'd heard it correctly, but Liam smiled and said it again, clearer this time. "Mama." It was the first real word he had ever said. She knelt down and hugged him, holding back tears. From that moment, the word became part of their daily life. He used it for comfort, for attention, and simply because it made him happy. It was the word he chose, and Ava didn't correct him. She let him call her what felt right to him. The atmosphere inside the mansion began to change. It no longer felt like a place full of silence and distance. Richard, now fully involved, joined Ava and Liam every morning for breakfast. He no longer hid behind work or meetings. Instead, he asked questions, joined in games, and even tried to help Liam with his learning exercises. At first, he was unsure of himself, afraid he'd do something wrong. But Ava encouraged him, and slowly, his confidence grew. The house staff also noticed the shift. Rooms once closed off were opened. Toys were scattered around the living room. Music played quietly in the background. Laughter, real laughter, echoed through the halls. Ava remained the center of it all, guiding Liam through this new phase of life while helping Richard adjust to fatherhood. The cold, empty home where pain had lived for so long began to feel like a family house. It wasn't perfect, but it was healing. For the first time, Liam had safety, love, and a voice that people finally listened to. As the legal case moved forward, more truths were uncovered. Families from different states gave testimony. Medical staff admitted they had been pressured or paid to stay silent. Neurosonics executives were called into court, and Rinaldi faced a long list of charges. Richard used his platform not just to support the case, but to create awareness. He gave interviews, not as a businessman, but as a father. He explained how he had once ignored signs, how his grief had blinded him, and how Ava had helped him open his eyes. He pledged funds to support children with communication disabilities and to ensure no child would be exploited the way Liam had been. His name, once linked to silence and emotional distance, became connected to justice and reform. Ava stayed out of the spotlight, preferring to focus on Liam. But Richard never let her role be forgotten. In every interview, he mentioned her. "She didn't just save my son," he said once. "She saved me too." She had become something much more. She had stood by Liam when no one else did. She had fought through fear, risked her safety, and challenged powerful people just to protect a child who wasn't even her own. Richard watched her every day and realized she was the reason their lives had changed. It wasn't about gratitude anymore. It was about love and respect. He began to feel something he hadn't felt in years: peace. He no longer walked through the halls in silence. He no longer saw Liam as a painful reminder. He saw him as a son, full of life and hope. And when he looked at Ava, he didn't see an employee. He saw the woman who brought light into their lives. As the legal fight continued and the world reacted to the scandal, inside that once lonely house, a family was finally being built. Not perfect, not planned, but real. And that, for Richard, meant everything. On a quiet afternoon, the garden behind the mansion was calm and peaceful. The sky was clear, and the sun gave a soft light over the grass and flowers. Ava sat on a bench near the small fountain, watching Liam as he picked up stones and leaves, lining them up carefully on the path. He was focused, smiling a little, proud of the little collection he was building. Every so often, he looked up at her to make sure she was watching. She smiled each time, nodding and giving him a thumbs up. Then, after a short pause, Liam stood, walked toward her, and climbed onto the bench beside her. He looked at her closely, tilting his head slightly. "Mama," he said quietly. Ava froze, her breath caught. She looked at him, her eyes wide. "Mama," he repeated more confidently this time, her eyes filled with tears. She reached out and pulled him into a hug. It wasn't the first time he'd said it, but this time it felt different. It felt final, real. From the terrace, Richard had been watching them. He wasn't trying to spy, he just liked seeing them together. For weeks, he had been noticing the bond between Ava and Liam grow stronger. But hearing Liam say, "Mama," made something hit deep inside him. He slowly walked down the steps and approached them, hands in his pockets, unsure how to speak. Ava looked up when she saw him coming, wiping her tears, but not letting go of Liam. Richard sat down beside them, silent for a few seconds, then finally said, "I've been selfish." Ava didn't answer right away. She let him continue. "I didn't allow myself to love him. I couldn't. Every time I looked at Liam, I saw her, and I blamed him without even realizing it. I blamed a baby for something he didn't do." His voice broke slightly. "I missed everything." Ava looked at him carefully, choosing her words. Liam never asked for perfection. He just needed his dad to show up. He looked at Liam, who was now back to placing leaves in a circle on the bench. "I thought I was doing the right thing by staying out of the way," Richard said. "I thought I was protecting him from my pain. But all I did was make him feel alone." Ava nodded. "You can't change the past, Richard. But you can be here now." He stared at the ground, ashamed but grateful for her honesty. Then he looked at her and said, "You've done everything I was supposed to do. You saw him. You fought for him. You never gave up on him." Ava took a deep breath. "I didn't see him as a responsibility. I saw him as a child who needed love, and I just gave what I could." Richard nodded slowly. "You've been more than just his caregiver, Ava. You've been his mother in every way that matters." Then Richard turned toward Ava. "I've been thinking about something for a while," he said slowly. "Not marriage. I'm not talking about that, but something important. Ava raised an eyebrow, listening. Richard continued, "I want you to be Liam's legal guardian. Not instead of me, alongside me." Ava blinked, surprised. "Are you serious?" Richard nodded. "Liam deserves to know he belongs to someone, that he's not just being passed around or watched by someone paid to be there. You've been his mother in every way. I want it to be official. I want him to feel safe, really safe with both of us." Ava didn't know what to say at first. She looked at Liam again. He was laughing now, focused on his tiny stick house. "We're not replacing his mother," Richard added. "I know that. We're building something new. Something real." Ava nodded slowly, tears in her eyes again. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I want that too." There were forms to file, background checks to complete, and legal language to work through, but Richard was sure of his decision. He wasn't doing this just because of guilt. He was doing it because he had finally opened his eyes to what mattered. Meanwhile, Ava prepared a small celebration for Liam in the kitchen. Nothing big, just his favorite foods, some paper decorations, and a few balloons. When Liam walked in and saw it, his eyes lit up. He didn't need to know about paperwork or legal status. All he knew was that the two people who cared for him were both there, together and happy. That night, after he went to sleep, Ava and Richard sat quietly in the living room. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. There was a quiet understanding now. Their family, though unusual, was finally forming. In the days that followed, Liam continued making progress. He was more talkative, more engaged, and less afraid. Ava remained his comfort, his guide, and now, officially, one of his guardians. Richard became more involved, showing up every day not just as a parent, but as someone who wanted to be better. They attended therapy sessions together, made decisions as a team, and slowly introduced Liam to new experiences outside the house. There were challenges, yes, moments where fear returned, or where Liam struggled to express himself, but there was also laughter, warmth, and consistency. For the first time in Liam's life, he knew what it felt like to be chosen, not by force or by accident, but on purpose. Ava had been there from the start, fighting for him when no one else would. And now Richard had stepped up, not just as a father, but as someone willing to learn and grow. Together, they weren't trying to copy the past. They were building something entirely new, a family where Liam truly belonged. Months had passed since everything changed. The mansion that once felt cold and quiet was now full of life. Liam had started school again, this time in a classroom that welcomed him, with teachers trained to work with children who needed extra support. He had new friends, a routine, and even a few favorite snacks he liked to share at lunchtime. But today was different. Today was the school recital. Dozens of parents sat in the small auditorium, holding phones and cameras, waiting for their children to appear on stage. Backstage, Liam waited nervously in a small group of classmates. He wore a clean white shirt, his hair gently combed, and in front of him stood a small keyboard. Ava crouched nearby, whispering encouragement before he went on. Richard stood behind her, giving a thumbs up. Liam took a deep breath, then stepped onto the stage. The crowd quieted as he sat at the keyboard, hands shaking a little. Then he played a simple, slow melody, soft but clear. Every note reached his ears. He could hear everything. Liam's new hearing support wasn't experimental or dangerous. It was carefully chosen and adapted by real specialists who worked closely with Dr. Ward. The device didn't cause him pain or confusion. It didn't send unknown signals to his brain. It simply did what it was supposed to do, help him hear the world around him safely. As he played, he heard the soft sounds of the keys, and when he finished, he heard something even more powerful, the loud clapping from the audience. People stood and cheered. A few classmates cheered his name. Liam looked up, eyes wide. His lips curled into a proud smile. For the first time in his life, he wasn't being watched as a problem to be fixed. He wasn't the broken boy in the corner. He was a student on stage, part of something. He gave a little bow, and the cheers grew louder. Ava covered her mouth with one hand as tears ran down her cheeks. Richard stood beside her, eyes red but smiling. They stood hand in hand, watching the boy they had almost lost. Richard squeezed Ava's hand tightly. Neither of them said anything for a while. There were no words needed. They had fought long and hard for this moment. Liam had gone from silent corners and misunderstood behavior to smiling under the stage lights, playing music and hearing the sound of applause. Richard felt something lift from his chest, a weight he had carried for too long. He had once believed his son would never hear or speak. He had once allowed others to define Liam's life, but now, standing beside the woman who had changed everything, he felt proud, not just of Liam, but of what they had built together. Ava wiped her tears, then leaned forward and waved at Liam. He waved back excitedly. It was a small gesture, but one that meant everything. It meant he saw them, he knew they were there, and he knew that all of it, every single part, was real. As news of the neurosonic scandal spread across the country, it became a national example of how vulnerable lives could be exploited in the name of science and profit. Major networks interviewed doctors, families, and former employees. Lawmakers demanded change. Medical schools started using the case as a warning. Articles were written, public panels were held, and through it all, Ava remained at the center, not for fame, but for purpose. She launched a non-profit organization focused on protecting children from unethical medical testing. Its mission was clear. Every child deserves safety, truth, and proper care. The organization offered legal help, medical reviews, and support groups for affected families. Richard didn't hesitate to fund the foundation's launch. He became its largest donor and public supporter, using his platform to speak for those who hadn't been heard. At events, he spoke as a father, not a billionaire. Ava handled the daily operations, hiring a team and building programs. Together, they turned pain into something powerful, something that could protect others. Back at home, life for Liam became exactly what it should have always been: normal. He played in the yard. He had birthday parties. He argued with friends over which cartoon was better. He tried new foods, some he hated and others he loved. He went to therapy not because something was wrong with him, but because it helped him understand his feelings and express himself better. He laughed loudly, sang songs he made up, and ran down the halls of the mansion like it belonged to him. And it did. Richard and Ava continued building their new family life. Weekends were spent at parks, movie nights, and board games. There were challenges, of course, but they faced them together. The house that once echoed with grief now echoed with footsteps, conversation, and Liam's constant energy. No more dark corners, no more silence. Liam's voice was part of everything now. He was never pushed aside, never ignored. He was seen, he was loved, and he was happy. The day after the recital, Liam asked Ava if they could play music together again. She smiled and nodded, sitting with him at the small piano in the living room. Richard joined too, tapping along on the table like a drum. The three of them laughed through wrong notes and silly rhythms. Liam didn't care about getting it perfect. He just liked the sound and the people who listened. In that moment, Ava looked at him and felt something deep in her chest. She remembered the boy she found crying under a table, holding a device that brought him pain. She remembered the nights she stayed awake, trying to figure out how to help him. Now, here he was, sitting between her and Richard, safe and full of joy. As Liam played a final note and smiled up at them, Ava felt peace. He wasn't a mystery anymore. He wasn't a case or a report. He was just a kid, a son. And finally, after all the noise, he was understood. Finally, we've reached the end of this story. I'm extremely happy that you've made it this far. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought, and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe until next time.